Well, thank you very much, Molly, and welcome everyone to the Bakken Center for Spirituality and Healing webinar series. As Molly said, I'm Dr. Mary Jo Kreitzer, the founder and director of the center. For more than 25 years, we've been advancing well-being in people, organizations, and communities. And we're very excited to be hosting our speaker today, Richard Leider, who will be hosting the center's first book club conversation about his newest book, Who Do You Want to Be When You Grow Up and Grow Old? The Path of Purposeful Aging. If you haven't read the book yet, don't worry, there'll be no pop quizzes and you'll still be able to fully participate. The connection between purpose and well-being is well established. In fact, purpose is one of the 6 dimensions of well-being that's featured in the center's well-being model. We all have a need to explore and find purpose in life. Some people find a way to express purpose in their jobs or career, while others look for opportunities outside their professional life. Regardless of how we do it, we all seek to find how we can best contribute to a purposeful life. Many years ago, I partnered with Richard to create the Purpose Project, in which we explored purpose in the second half of life. What we discovered that was not surprising is that participants often said, "I wish this was available for my adult children or my grandchildren." Purpose is so important at every age and stage of life. Aging has deep connections to wholeness. And on his website, Richard notes that everyone is getting old, but not everyone is growing old. But the path of purposeful aging is accessible to all, and it's fundamental to health, happiness, and longevity. Richard is the founder of Inventure, the Purpose Company, and is ranked by Forbes as one of the top 5 most respected executive coaches. He's a best-selling author, coach, and keynote speaker, and is a pioneer and innovator in the study of purpose. Richard has written 11 books, including 3 bestsellers, which have sold more than 1 million copies and have been translated into 20 languages. He holds a master's degree in counseling and is a national certified counselor and a national certified master career counselor. In addition to being a senior fellow at the Bakken Center, he's also a public fellow at the Notre Dame Institute of Advanced Study, where he also partners with their Inspired Leadership Initiative. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Mary Jo and Molly. It's a privilege to have been on this journey with the center and with you, Mary Jo, for a long, long time, growing together. And this question, what on earth am I here for, is a question that I've lived in, both in study and in practice for decades. So I consider myself in many ways kind of a pioneer in the purpose movement, if you will. And this book is the 6th book that I co-authored with David Shapiro. And David is a tenured philosophy professor in Seattle, Washington, head of the Department of Humanities at Cascadia Community College, and among other things. And so we've had the opening of this book, the question often when we're younger is, what do you want to be when you grow up? But now that you're grown up, who do you want to be as you age, when you grow old? And so what we've laid out is what we call the path of purposeful aging. Because as Mary Jo aptly said, purpose is fundamental to health, to healing, to happiness, and ultimately to longevity. So the science has really caught up with the narrative in many ways over my study of this to show that both science and faith agree that purpose is not a luxury, but is actually fundamental in many ways. And so David and I have had, the opening chapter is called The Long Conversation. And kind of quirky, this conversation started when the 2 of us, after working together on a project, when David was in town here from Seattle, we went to a Twins game at Target Field, and we were there, and we were excited. We're both kind of baseball geeks. In certain ways, we like to watch baseball, but we got rained out. And so as we were walking around the concourse, we continued our conversation and then decided that even though we're rained out, the depth of our conversation was so good that we wanted to continue it. So it ended up in this book. And so the opening chapter is the long conversation talking about how we developed and combined 150 years of combined experience into this book. And then the end of the book is the ultimate conversation, the end of life conversation that often has been triggered these days by the pandemic. And the pandemic has really fueled or triggered kind of the ultimate conversation, because we stare at life in new realities, new ways, and it is resulting in, the media calls it the Great Resignation, but we call it, and I call it, the Great Reimagining, because what's happening and I've been on book tour now for almost 6 months, and I've had many, many conversations with many, many people, and people are wanting to really dig into the bigger questions right now. What on earth am I here for? What am I doing with my time, my gifts, my talents? Where am I doing it with my work and all of those kinds of things? And so, as Mary Jo said, the spoiler alert is this, that you're getting older. The question is, are you growing older? And how you feel about aging, whether you're pro-aging or anti-aging, has a lot to do with how you age. Now, that's a big idea right there, which says, how you feel about the aging process, who you bring, your mindset, your practices, has an awful lot to do with how you age. And let's take a look at this next slide here that says, does greater longevity have a purpose? Earlier in our history, the average life expectancy, like in 1900, was 47. And now it's in the 80s, and the number of centenarians and fastest growing cohorts over 85 are, really ramping up in many ways. And so it's causing us to step back and say, we're going to possibly be what used to be called retired. That's a whole nother conversation here that I'll dig into in a minute. But we may be retired or living in this last part of life longer than we did in the first part of life. And so, it could be 3 decades, could be 4 decades. So what's the point of the exercise? Or what is the new reality of longevity in many ways? And as we wrote this book, it started at a Twins game with 9 innings that never happened. We have 9 chapters, and each chapter has a question. And one of the questions that we ask is this: am I living a default life? What we found in our interviews with people for this book and in the work that we've both done, David and I, is that many people find themselves at some point in their life feeling like they're living a default life. And a default life is really one that you kind of took up what was available to you work-wise or relationship-wise or geographically. At the time, you didn't really choose it. It kind of was what you did. Someone said, oh, you should go to this school, or you should major in this, or you should do something like that. And you went that way. And then you get up to a certain point in a long life and you say, do I have to keep doing this forever? Maybe what about the other parts of my life? How can I grow whole, not just grow old, and fill in some of these spaces? So sometimes we're, in life, we're pushed by pain, and sometimes we're pulled by possibility. We all have things that happen in our lives. And the pandemic has obviously pointed that out in a major way worldwide. Sometimes pushed by pain and sometimes pulled by possibility. So one of the big insights that I have had, which may not seem like a big insight to you, but we wrote about it in the book, is the distinction between purpose with a big P and purpose with a little p. Now, purpose with a big P is kind of that noble purpose, like I need to have something that's really great or a cause. And we often hear stories about people who have, done magnificent things with their lives and who have what is called perhaps a noble purpose, which is good. And we all have nobility in our lives and the possibility of doing things with that. But purpose with a small p, often when I talk about that, there's a big sigh of relief, because purpose with a small p is how can I authentically live a purposeful life today, day after day after day? What are the practices of purpose with a small p? For example, my purpose with a big P is to make a difference, is to help people unlock the power of purpose. My purpose with a small p is to make a difference in one single person's life every single day, intentionally. And so one of the big breakthroughs for me was that you can't have a noun without a verb when it comes to purpose. The noun of purpose is, what is my purpose? The verb is, what am I doing today to live purposefully? And so big breakthrough for me that happened with the purpose study was action precedes clarity. Action precedes clarity. When we act purposefully on a day-to-day basis, intentionally, it leads us to the noun, to having a purpose and to being able to name that in certain ways. And so purposeful living is what we're talking about, and purposeful aging is what this book is about in many ways. And another spoiler alert, in case purpose is still big P, little p, more than you bargained for, let me just give you a purpose. And because after all these years, the sort of the universal purpose is to grow and give. That's it. Does greater longevity have a purpose? Yep. It's to grow and give. Are you growing? If not, you're dying. And are you giving? Are you making an impact? And I've told this story before, but one of my colleagues, when you call his phone and you don't get him, the answering machine says, at the sound of the tone, please leave your answer to life's two eternal questions. Who are you and what do you want? Well, longevity begs that question. Who are you and what do you want? And so that's what we tried to answer in this book, the who are you and what do you want questions. And grow and give is basically the universal response to longevity does have a purpose. But purpose is also age agnostic. It is like the center has learned that there's as many college age students who are interested in purpose as there are people aging, or at the other side of the age spectrum. So it comes in different ways, but we all have the need to do two things: to belong and to matter. That's it. That's the bottom line in many ways. We all want to belong. We all want to feel like we are connected in whether it's family or community or whatever it is. And I think that's what the great, what they call the Great Resignation in many ways is about today. And the Great Reimagining is to look at new ways to belong and to matter. And of course, the work world is one of those big places, as Mary Jo has pointed out. And so I want to talk just a little bit about the ultimate conversation. What am I really called to do in life? And so the next slide kind of points this out. It actually came from, calling is another word for purpose. It's a vocationally charged word about purpose. And this model I learned from one of my early mentors, and still a mentor, although deceased, Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And I spent a week with Viktor Frankl in 1968, and it changed my life forever. And Frankl was, I call him the godfather of meaning and purpose, but he wrote the seminal bestseller in the Library of Congress. It's number 12 as the most influential books in American history, called Man's Search for Meaning. That book came out of his work in logotherapy, or meaning therapy, along with the fact that he and his whole family, he was a Jewish psychiatrist / neurologist in Vienna, and his whole family was taken to Nazi concentration camps. He was the only one who survived. He was liberated after 3 years, weighed 87 pounds, went back to Vienna, healed, and wrote Man's Search for Meaning in 9 days. And I studied him in graduate school. But then all of a sudden, I had the opportunity to really to be in person with him and study with him for a week. And this is the first thing he wrote. He said, see the line that goes from left to right? That's the line of failure and success. So picture that Viktor Frankl, he's got thick glasses, his teeth aren't good, he's kind of hunched after the concentration camp experience, but you could hear a pin drop for 5 straight days. And on a blackboard with the dust and chalk flying, he says, ladies and gentlemen, look at this line from failure to success. You can all put yourself on that line. And then he wrote the vertical line from fulfillment, meaning to despair. And you can put yourself on that line in certain ways. And so he said, in the lower left-hand box, the next slide, is a job. Sometimes we do what we have to do to make a living. And that is, doesn't necessarily bring us up the ladder of success, nor the ladder of meaning, but it pays the bills and gets us. And as Chris Farrell, one of the National Public Radio and NPR correspondent, his story is in the book. He talks about the essential purpose and a paycheck, which is one of his books that I happen to be in as well. But sometimes we want purpose, but we want a paycheck first. So the next slide, which is career. Sometimes we're moving up the ladder of success, but the pandemic comes along, or we plateau and we're not growing in our career. And what Frankl talks about, an existential vacuum. Sometimes that we're successful, but not feeling significant, not feeling like our lives really matter. And then the mission, the upper left-hand corner, is sometimes that we have a job and a mission. The mission comes at night or on the weekend or in our family or certain ways. Sometimes we can align our gifts, passions, and values and create a mission that pays the bills as well. But where he went was the next box, and that was the breakthrough for me. He said, what we really want is success with fulfillment. And that's really what this book is about in many ways, is your calling? Because calling doesn't necessarily mean job, career, or mission in the way I just described it, but calling is from cradle to grave. We were all born with certain gifts and certain predispositions, and that doesn't end when we quote unquote retire or we move out of a job or a career. We bring who we are to what we do. And Frankl said this is the choice. The choice in a concentration camp, not many, but you could choose to live, hopefully, and to give a crust of bread or a slurp of soup or a hug or a hope to others. But your calling is, regardless of your adversity, you can choose how you approach it and how you deal with it. And that's what aging's about. There's a lot of talk about anti-aging and wanting to be younger, wanting to look younger, wanting to do certain things. With aging comes adversity. With aging comes possibility. There are 5 elements when I look at aging. People say, Richard, what scares you about aging? I mean, you're no spring chicken. Well, there are 5 elements that I look at and that we addressed in this book in a variety of different ways through stories and through examples and through practices. And it's a short book. If you've seen it, it's a beautifully designed, I must say, small book, less than 200 pages, but it gets right to the heart of the matter. And so it deals, first of all, with chronology. Aging is a number. So what does that number mean? Number, people say, I'm 77, I'll be 78 this year. And I don't really want to be 48. 78 is the new 78. This is what it looks like to me. And I want to be full out the best 78 that I can be, given my criteria for life. And I don't want to live a default life. And, the default life of aging has been 3 boxes: learn, earn, retire. There's a book, or there's a game out there. Some of you may have played this game called The Game of Life. It's based on that model. That book came out in 1860, and it's out there still today. Same model: learn, earn, retire. That model is dead on arrival for many, many people. And so it's a good game, but the model is no longer relevant to many of us and to perhaps most of us. The new model, though, is we've added a whole new phase of life to grow and to give, or to do what we choose to do with that part of our lives. So there's the chronology of aging. There's psychological aging. Are we maturing? There are 2 times that we grow up. One is from adolescence to adulthood, and the next is from adulthood to elderhood. Elderhood is what I'm studying and writing about and living in, hopefully, today. How about you? What does it take to let go of adulthood and move into being a full-out elder in certain ways? And then there's spiritual aging. There's maturing and looking at how we look at life. And we call that growing whole, not old. Growing spiritually does not necessarily mean any particular faith or dogma or practice, but it looks at the whole. And what it looks at really is dying, and using, like a number of stories in the book from people like Parker Palmer, people like Kathy Wurzer, local NPR personality who's got a project called End in Life, End in Mind, about the end of life. And they all live with the Saint Benedictine quote that says this, and I live with this as well: keep death daily before your eyes. Keep death daily before your eyes. Now, some people would consider that morbid. I consider it inspiring, because I realize that it helps me stay more present, helps me prioritize things, helps me do things like that. So there's chronological, there's psychological, there's spiritual, and then there's aging in society. Ageism is alive and well, and I'm sure there'll be some questions about that, but what we want to remain is relevant in life in many ways. And of course, there's physical aging. And so let me just end here with this, and then turn it back to Mary Jo, and we can deal with some questions. And that is this. So people say, yeah, but so let's look at the next slide here. Is your calling? Yeah, but what if I get an illness? What if I don't have money? Well, one of the stories in the book that to me is the most relevant and inspiring for many people is the story of Ed Rapp. Ed was one of the top executives at Caterpillar, about to be named probably CEO worldwide of Caterpillar, the earth-moving company, the big yellow machines, et cetera. He was out running with his son, and he noticed his foot was dragging. And to make a long story short, he found out at the Mayo Clinic that he has ALS. At the age of 57, he had to immediately retire and go back to Raleigh, North Carolina, and see what he could do, because with ALS, you have a 5 to 7 year, he's in year 6.5 sentence in terms of how things are going to progress. Rather than saying, going into a default life, he said, Richard, I'm living the good life. It's not the life I wanted. And I didn't expect to get ALS. I was at the top of my game. I was happy, and I had a happy family and a strong faith and all of this. And he did 2 things. Big P, purpose. He founded something called Live Strong ALS, which he so far has raised, Stay Strong ALS. He has raised $15 million for ALS research. And because he had a lot of places to go. Small p, really inspiring. Every single morning he gets up and he has a call with somebody who he's never met and will never see, probably, who just was diagnosed with ALS and is scared, terrified. And he has that conversation with people. And he said, it makes me feel so alive. It makes so much joy in my life. In spite of my, he walks now with arm crutches and he's got different things that, his ALS is progressing, but he's choosing, in spite of it all, to live purposefully. So the physical part of aging is there. It's going to be there. And the chapter in the book that he named is this: will I earn a passing grade in life? Will I earn a passing grade in life? And who gets to determine that? Well, the napkin test is one way. One way to earn a passing grade is to use your gifts on things you feel passionate and purposeful about in environments that really fit your voice, your values. And as Frankl said, you find significance and success with meaning in that way. So, Mary Jo, let me stop right there and bring us back to questions. Writing a book like this has been life-changing for me in my own way, looking at aging. And your story is in the book. And why is that in there? Because you and I have grown together, and I've known you and you've known me, and your story, but your mother died at a young age and informed your own view of aging. And I'm sure people would like to know what that is. And also, how come you haven't retired yet?
So you're turning the questions on me right away, Richard.
Oh,
Well,
why not?
it's true. My mother died when she was young. She was 62 years old, had a brain tumor. And I can remember, actually, I'm sure a lot of people will relate to this. I was in my, late 30s at the time. And I remember thinking, well, she's old. She's had a good life. And then when I started reaching that age, I realized, oh my gosh, how young she was. But my mother, who was a psych mental health nurse, actually really believed that death would be a great adventure. And so, attitude, as you've said, Richard, makes such a difference. And, she had been fascinated, in her personal as well as professional life, in the whole concept of death and dying. And how do we sort of just acknowledge that, as part of living? And so I certainly think that has shaped and framed my perspective. But the other question that you asked, and that you interviewed me about in the book was that whole question, like, when do you plan on retiring? And, I think I said in the book, as long as I can grow and give back, I don't want to retire. But
Right.
I guess truly my measure is, do I feel like I'm making a difference? And, I've just had the opportunity, at the center to continue to work with an amazing group of talented people, not only at the center, but university around the world. And, as long as I feel like I can, sort of be on the edge of making a difference, it's personally meaningful and fulfilling to me. But one of the things that I've really had to recognize over the years, I think while I talk in that book about, moving to a different phase of life and mentoring, being a major focus, what I think is also so important as we age is to continue to, have great humility about the limits of our knowledge and be really opening to learning and growing. And I just say that because I work with an amazing group of people. I guess I would say all of them at this stage of life are younger than me. And there are new ideas and there's new technologies and there's new ways of doing things. And it's just so critical, I think, to continue to be curious
Right.
and, to want to learn. So
yeah, one of the stories in the book is a story of Parker Palmer. And Parker is 82 now, and he endorsed the book, and there's a story about it. And one of those comments that was really a showstopper for me, and plays into what you just said, he says, I can't imagine living without a vocation.
Mm-hmm.
And what he was talking about is a calling, to respond to a calling, not a job, not a career, But he said, I get up every day, and his new book, or his newest book, just came out, I guess a year and a half or 2 years ago, called On the Brink of Everything. And it's on the brink of aging, on the brink of ending life, and he gets into that way. But he said, so I'm wondering how people feel about that on this. Can you imagine living without a vocation? Now, you have to define what vocation is, and you've defined it. You just did, about growing and being on the edge of learning and all of that, and being able to give back at the same time with that.
So, Richard, I was so glad that you talked about Dr. Frankl and what a mentor Viktor Frankl was for you. And I remember, a story you once told about when he came to, the Twin Cities. And sometimes people think purpose is elitist and it's only for people who can afford to think about such things. But I can remember the story that you told about even being in Target, and I'll let you tell the story and sort of his insight.
Well, he came to town and his luggage didn't arrive with him, and they still didn't know where it was at the time. And this is a long time ago. And so his host, who was a seminary professor at Luther Seminary, took him to Target to get the essentials of what he would need. And he was overwhelmed by looking at Target at that time. Now he'd probably be more overwhelmed, but he died 14 years ago or so. So he's not going to get that option. But as they're checking out, he saw, it used to be that they had books, paperbacks at the checkout counter, in addition to gum and lifesavers and all of that. And he saw Man's Search for Meaning at the checkout counter, and his host was mortified that a famous guy who'd written a philosophical and worldwide reputation, 30 honorary doctorates around the world, et cetera, would see his book at the checkout counter. And he said, no, this is where it should be. Purpose and meaning is for every human being, and it should be right here where it is. So that's kind of like the purpose with a big P, purpose with a little p. And he was all about both of those.
So, Richard, a lot of great questions are coming in. And so I'm just going to kind of pepper our conversation with some of these questions. And someone writes that, does one's calling and purpose change over time? And, contrary to the idea of people being born with a purpose that they just stick with their entire life, can you talk about how purpose evolves?
Well, it evolves in terms of what we do and with it. But as I said, purpose is a noun and purpose is a verb. And the verb part of it is how you act. And the one thing that doesn't change is this. Purpose is always about your contribution to life, to others. So purpose isn't a goal. Purpose is a contribution that we make. We bring our gifts to life and to our communities and to others. I say the purpose goes, and Frankl agreed that purpose goes through 3 stages. First, it's about me, because I have to learn about myself. I have to be self-aware. Then it's about us. It's not about just me, but it's about my community or my others. And then ultimately, purpose is about all of us. So when we think about the great sages or spiritual teachers or the people that come to the center for that, like him, purpose is about all of us. It doesn't end just with my goals or my people, or we bring purpose to life on a day-to-day basis, like he did in the concentration camp. So I think the one thing that doesn't change is that it's contribution to others.
Mm-hmm. So another participant writes, could you give some examples of daily, regular, purposeful actions that precede clarity? When you talked about action precedes clarity, because sometimes people think it's the opposite, that if you are clear, and then that might lead to purpose.
Well, first of all, it's being intentional, having an intentional mindset. So one of the practices is called the 2-minute purpose practice. I call it that, I should say. And that is, before you get out of bed in the morning, pause. In other words, don't reach for your phone. Breathe, take 3 deep breaths or more, And then ask yourself, how am I going to make a difference in someone's life today? So picture your upcoming day and picture how you might make a contribution. So that's kind of setting the stage, your mindset, your intention. The other thing is I call, in many ways, I've done this for years, the Post-it practice. Write a purpose like grow and give on a Post-it and put it on your mirror. And in the morning, ask yourself, how am I going to grow and give today? And at the end of the day, before you go to bed at night, ask yourself, how did I grow and give today? As I said, my big P purpose is to help others unlock the power of purpose. But my little p purpose, which really gives me a felt sense of purpose, that's the thing that I'm after here, is a felt sense that this feels good. This feels fulfilling. It's not just because I checked the box on my legacy or that I should do this. It's a better day when I can make a difference in someone's life. And so I look for those. There are 1,440 purpose moments every day. And if you take sleep out of it, or it'd be less, but let's just say 1,440 purpose moments in a day. Each of those moments is a chance. Is it about you or is it about them? Can I listen? Can I confirm? Can I do something in that moment to help somebody else, to contribute? And so there's many different ways to do that, where everybody's an experiment of one. But the bottom line here is this, Mary Jo, that I think is really, the pandemic has really pointed this out. Isolation is fatal. Going it alone every day or just for yourself is fatal to the human spirit and is fatal ultimately to a long, fulfilling life. We live, we want to belong, and we want to matter. How do we go about that? Those are, 1,440 options every day.
That's powerful, Richard. I recently finished reading another purpose book titled Women Rowing North. And it was written by Mary Pfeiffer,
Yeah.
Who had written a book many, many years ago, Reviving Ophelia, which was all about young women growing from adolescence into adulthood. But Mary in that book also writes about, it's all about intention and attitude. And attitude makes such a difference.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. This may seem like it's really one-off, but one of my clients is the sponsor of the Rolling Stones tour going across the US. And they invited my wife, Sally, and me to go to the Rolling Stones concert. And we were really terrified we hadn't been to one. And we weren't particularly fans, but we thought, well, this could be, it was at the US Bank Stadium. And downtown, there's going to be 60, 70,000 people there. We were, with COVID, we were thinking this is not a good idea. Anyway, we went. And here we've got a band that's in their 70s. Mick Jagger, 78, Keith Richards, 76, the new drummer replacing Charlie Watts, 73. And that song, You Can't Always Get What You Want, came up. Well, with aging, you can't always get what you want, but then you might get what you need. If you try, you might get what you need. And I thought, well, I looked at Sally and she looked at me and said, "Isn't that what you talk about?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "Yes, but I don't want to make a joke out of it, but trying means mindset and practices is the point. You might get what you need if you show up, if you do things that are purposeful. You will lead you to the noun having a purpose." So I thought, here's another, example. But I looked at the fact that why are they still doing this in their 70s? And they were out there for 2.5 hours, nonstop. And it was not just about physical aging and all of the things that you could talk about, but there was a certain spirit of, I don't know what to call it, but there was a certain giving there that just seemed relevant in the moment.
Well, purpose, meaning, joy, giving back. So here you had more alignment with the Stones than you even expected to.
True. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't go, and I wasn't a groupie, but there were all these people that were willing to stand up for 2.5 hours and listen, because we stood the whole time.
Oh my goodness. Well, somebody else writes, Richard, can you describe ways to keep death daily in one's life? What does that look like? What does it look like for you?
Well, it's the reality. The ultimate conversation that is the end of the book is really for me, the most powerful part of the book, because David and I said, if we're going to take the ultimate conversation on, what is it? And we better answer it ourselves personally. And so there's three questions. What do you think happens when you die? Secondly, how would you like to die? And third, what gifts do you want to leave the world before you die, not after? Because often legacy is after you die. And so we answer that ourselves, and it's very, very personal. But if you just took the third question, and the pandemic has raised all of these questions for us in certain ways at all ages. As I said, purpose is age agnostic. It's younger and mid and older. But you've known somebody who's sick, or you've been sick, or someone who's died, so I think keeping death daily before your eyes means understanding that you're penciled in for a short time, and you better make choices that, or not better, but you can make choices that are authentically important to you. And now's the time. And so I think the Great Resignation or the Great Reimagining has people looking at the end in order to look at the present in certain ways. So I'm not going to put up with this anymore, or I'm not going to do this anymore. My time is my most precious currency, and my health and everything else. So I think it's not a macabre thing. It's something that just says, look, the reality is this. And as the book points out, who do you want to be when you grow old is a choice. You can make moves here that will make this part of your life. The science right now shows that this new life stage is the most happiest time worldwide. They call it the U curve of happiness. Well, how do we make it the U curve of happiness? We do it by having a mindset and practices that make it so.
I just love, Richard, the way you framed the Great Resignation to the Great Reimagining. And I truly think for many, that is what's happened during COVID, is that they have stepped back and really questioned what's really important in my life. And, what are my options? What do I want to do? There's quite a few questions that have come in about COVID times, and I just want to address a couple of them. One person writes, I've got two daughters who have come of age in the time of climate change, racial injustice, and COVID, and they're struggling with the why, bother of life. And they're also challenged with mental health issues. What thoughts do you have about how do we give youth hope?
Well, that's a really big one. And I wish I had clean, clear solution to that. But I go back to what Carl Jung said. He said, the greatest damage you can do to youth is your own unlived life. The greatest damage you can do to youth or others, your young daughters, is your own unlived life. So the starting point is that. It's what choices are you making? What mindset are you bringing? What contribution? And that's sometimes the best we can do. Other than that, it's helping people with their own napkin test. It's their own, what are their gifts? We all have gifts. And when I ask people, do you have siblings, for example, and they raise their hand, I said, are your siblings' gifts the same as yours? And they laugh and say, no, they're all different. Well, how do they learn that? How do they learn that those are my gifts and those are valuable? And how do I live an authentic life? Not easy these days. There's not an easy answer, but the starting point is there's three stages to it, Mary Jo, sort of in a tutorial. There's self-awareness about who you are and what is really important to you, like your gifts, passions, and values type of thing. There's self-development. What are you doing to develop those? And then there's self-gift, because calling in many ways is the inner urge to give back, to give your gifts at any age. It's the inner urge to give your gifts in many ways. And that is part of what it means to be a human being. But sometimes that gets suffocated by the pandemic or by global climate change or things like that. But you find people who are depressed oftentimes do better when they help others. And they get out of their own way in certain ways, and not easy. I'm not preachy about this. This is not an easy question to answer. But what do you think? You're in the business of helping people do this as well. That's why I love being part of the center, is that, there's all kinds of different facets to answer that particular question.
Well, there's no doubt, Richard, and there's actually good research to show that there's a healing power of doing good. And that when we give back, give to others, it
Right.
helps us as much as those we're serving. But I
Yep.
just want to reflect a moment on, the formula that you just gave, beginning with self-awareness. A lot of people wonder in these days, resilience seems so important, and how do you develop resilience? And one of my favorite definitions of resilience comes from the psychiatrist Stephen Southwick, who defines it as the capacity to bend but not break, and to bounce back.
Mhm.
And I just think you really defined some very specific steps to help really develop resilience.
And what we find, or what I find, and what in my observation of resilience, is that purpose, resilience for the sake, mindfulness, for example, for the sake of what? Is it just for the sake of yourself and your own, or is it for the sake of something bigger than yourself and larger than yourself? And when it's larger than yourself, you tend to do better. You need practices like mindfulness, like nutrition, like exercise, like sleep, like hydration, for the sake of what? What's the point of the exercise? And that's ultimately we all come to the point, whether we're pushed by pain or pulled by possibility, like my opening slide is, what on earth am I here for? What's the point of all this? And when we can have an answer to that, or a practice to answer that, we tend to do better.
So somebody else writing about COVID writes that COVID has certainly increased fears and
Yeah.
a sense of limbo and frenzy in people's lives. What thoughts do you have about ways to keep sense of calling front and center? And, do you have some ideas about how do you dialogue to support people at this time?
Well, as I said earlier, isolation is fatal. So the key is not to go it alone. And I've always been a fan, as you know, for years, of having a sounding board, minimally having a committed listener, somebody who really gets us, who listens to us at a deeper level, who practices care versus cure. They're not fixing us, they're caring enough to tell me more about that. And so I can help me get it out or figure it out myself. And a sounding board often has other people on it, even if it's just metaphorically thinking about it and not connecting directly. But who's your wise elder? Who are people? And that's why the stories in the book are about wise elders, but they're not famous people necessarily. They're people who are, there's a story in the book about someone in Minneapolis called Tracy Hudson, who George Floyd's killing, she and her daughter started to make banners and do things to do something rather than just, go like this with their hands about and out of that, they didn't solve the world's problems, but they did better. And they felt like they were fulfilling some calling, so to speak. So I think in a lot of ways, sounding board has a committed listener, has a wise elder, has maybe a wise younger, somebody who can teach us in certain ways. And one of the stories in the book is about Chip Connolly, and he coined the term mentor. How about being a mentor and an intern at the same time? In other words, offering something to others, but also being a learner with others. So having a wise younger on your board can be helpful. But what I talk about is a purpose partner, at least one person who you go with, who you check in with about how you're doing, and gets you and listens. And if you go it alone, I think the center is a great place to meet other purpose partners, people who are on the path or on a path, and that get the fact that this is important. And so I find that isolation has really, really been brought front and center during the pandemic, and not just because we're doing Zoom now and not doing this live, but it's pointed out how people are feeling lonely.
Yeah, Richard, I often say that isolation is fatal, that the health risks of being alone are comparable to high blood pressure, heart disease, kind of other, physical ailments. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a huge risk.
Yeah.
Somebody wrote in, I think, a really thoughtful comment. They write, "This is the first time I've thought about a transition from adulthood to elderhood versus a transition from adulthood to basically old age. The idea that there are new possibilities in this life phase to grow into my real self is a really inspiring new paradigm for me." And, I wondered, Richard,
That's
if
why we
you,
wrote the book, because what we learned is that not only is it inspiring, which is fantastic, but it also has a lot to do with longevity and doing better as you age. When you grow whole, not just old, because you're getting old regardless. You started getting old when you were born, but when you're growing whole and growing old and opening up new chapters like that, you tend to do better, health-wise and longevity-wise.
Mhm. So, Richard, throughout, the centuries, people have written about the good life, and there's lots of definitions of the good life. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about how you define the good life. I love your definition because I think that fits a little bit into this comment that, people can actively make choices, very intentional choices that lead them in that direction.
Well, I mean, I talked a bit earlier about, am I living a default life? Then if I'm not, what's the choice? So living a default life is often looking in the rear view mirror and living consistently with the past. And living a good life is looking in the windshield, which is way bigger than the rear view mirror, at what are the possibilities out there. And so when David and I wrote the book, Repacking Your Bags, Lighten Your Load for the Good Life, and did the research. He's a philosopher, so we went back to Plato and Aristotle and Seneca and many others who talked about it way back when. But the formula that we found was the most consistent was living in the place you love, with the people you love, doing the work you love with purpose. So place, people, right work, purpose. It's interesting because one of the interviews I did for the book was with something called the Real Estate Cafe in Boston. And they said that 46% of the people that they've measured, thousands of people, don't like living where they're living. They want to move. And it's not just they're going to move to, but they realize that they're only there because of reasons that are done for them, whatever the reasons were that got them there in the first place. So place is important, but you can be in the most beautiful place, and then it's people. Who are you? Who's in your orbit?
Right.
And that's where the Great Resignation. A lot of people found that the work culture where they worked was not healthy for them. Was not a good fit. So people are family and community and other things, but it's also, we spend more time often with people we work with and at home in certain ways. And then right work is that formula of gifts, passions, and values. Is it a good fit? Are you growing? Because no matter what your career is or your job, there are you learn and you plateau and you either renew or you get stuck in certain ways. And then with purpose. So I want to share something along that lines that has been. I say to people, follow your thread, And the poet William Stafford, who wrote a poem a day for 30 years. I met him because I used to be on the board of Grey Wolf Press, and I met him at a board meeting and asked him, how could you write a poem a day for 30 years? And he said, oh, easy, lower your expectations. So he didn't write a great poem every day, but he wrote every day. And here's the one that really stuck with me that I think might be, when I say follow your thread, is this. It's called The Way It Is. It's very short. There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you're pursuing. You have to explain about the thread, but it's hard for others to see. While you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen, like the pandemic. Tragedies happen, people get hurt or die, and you suffer and get old. Nothing you do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread. So what we try to do in this book is to help people to discern what their thread might be, how to keep hold of that. And the good life is one way to think about that, but there are many other ways to think about it as well. One
So
of the
Richard,
chapters of the book is old. Who, me? Because oftentimes people say, I still feel like I'm 13 inside, but obviously my body has changed, and so being self-aware, developing self, and giving is really what it's all about ultimately for me.
Richard, I love that William Stafford poem, and I want to end with a question. It's a bit of a challenging question, and somebody writes about, like, what if you can't find that thread? And this person writes, what advice do you have for someone broken down by life who has no passion and who has tried multiple volunteer experiences that just left them feeling more marginalized?
Compassion for that person, but grow and give. Take the universal challenge to grow and give for 1 week.
Mhm.
Get up every morning and look at that Post-it on your mirror and ask yourself, how am I going to get outside of my own way here? My own self-absorption, my own brokenness. How am I going to grow and give today? And growing is all about curiosity. It's not about growing, having to go to school or having to read a book but what am I really curious about? And did I do anything about that curiosity today? Did I look it up or think about it or something? And then give. How, one moment today. And Viktor Frankl, that's why he was so revered, because he showed that in a concentration camp, you can do this. And it can help you get up in the morning with the will to live and the will to give. And that will not necessarily, you might not survive, but it'll help. And possibly you might. And he said the people who tended to survive did have that will and that to grow and to give in certain ways. So that's the best I can do for that person.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Richard. This has been an incredibly powerful hour, and I just want to thank you so much for spending this time with us. There were so many questions that we weren't able to touch. I think we could have been here for hours and had this deep conversation. So really wanted to thank you so much for being with us. Just a few announcements as we close the webinar today. The center has several webinars coming up, including our Wellbeing series, and we encourage you to visit our website to learn more. We also have many mindfulness classes starting in the next few weeks, and you can learn more about those too on our site. I want to acknowledge and thank all of the staff at the Bakken Center who helped make today's webinar possible. I hope, Richard, that you have a chance to look at the chat before we close, because there are amazing comments, and we'll send those to you in the chat. I want to thank all of you for being with us today and for participating so extensively. The University of Minnesota's Bakken Center is your trusted well-being resource. And as we close, remember that you do matter. Thanks very much.